It didn't start with shouting. It started with silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that feels heavy. The kind where everyone in the room knows something just shifted, but no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. They laughed. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough. And that was the moment. Because sometimes it's not the insult itself. It's the intention behind it. He didn't react right away. No sudden movement. No dramatic response. No anger. Just stillness. And that's what made it uncomfortable. You could almost feel the air change. Conversations that were flowing seconds ago suddenly slowed. People who were confident a minute earlier started avoiding eye contact. Why? Because something had gone too far. Not in a loud way. Not in a chaotic way. In a subtle way. There's a difference between disagreement and disrespect. Between challenge and humiliation. Between testing someone and underestimating them. And what just happened crossed that invisible line. But here's what most people don't understand. The most dangerous reaction isn't rage. It's control. When someone explodes, you expect it. When someone shouts, you prepare for it. When someone loses composure, you feel justified. But when someone stays calm, that's different. That's when people start questioning themselves. He didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just looked at them. Not with anger. Not with fear. With certainty. And certainty makes people nervous. Because certainty doesn't need approval. There's a moment, and you've probably experienced it, when you realize someone thought you wouldn't respond. When they assumed silence meant weakness. When they believed restraint meant submission. And then they push one step further. That step? That's where everything changes. You could see in the small details. The shift in posture. The measured breath. The steady gaze. Not the reaction of someone hurt. The reaction of someone who has decided. And that's what made the room tense. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about boundaries. There's a line everyone carries. Most never test it. Some test it accidentally. And a few test it intentionally. The problem is, once that line is crossed, you don't get to choose how the other person responds. What makes this moment powerful isn't what was said. It's what wasn't. No threats. No dramatic declarations. No emotional outburst. Just quiet acknowledgement that things were no longer the same. And here's the part that makes people uneasy. The ones who laughed first were the first to go silent. Because they realized something. They weren't dealing with someone impulsive. They were dealing with someone disciplined. And discipline doesn't react. It decides. That's the tipping point most people miss. The outside world sees a response. But the real shift happens internally. It's the second someone chooses not to be dismissed. Not to be underestimated. Not to be treated lightly. You can ignore disrespect once. Maybe twice. But eventually, silence becomes permission. And that's when a decision has to be made. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. And in that moment, when everything felt still, when no one quite knew what would happen next, one thing was certain. They had mistaken calm for weakness. And that was their first mistake. The question is, what happens when someone calm decides they're done being tested? Now here's where it gets interesting. Because it wasn't obvious at first. There was no dramatic announcement. No public challenge. No direct insult thrown across the room. It was smaller than that. A look, a tone, a certain kind of smile. The kind that says, we don't take you seriously. And sometimes that's louder than words. What happened wasn't loud enough to shock everyone, but it was clear enough for him to notice. And that's the detail that matters. Most people miss subtle disrespect because they're waiting for something obvious, something undeniable, something they can point at and say, see, that was wrong. This wasn't that. This was layered, measured, intentional. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about positioning, about quietly testing boundaries, about seeing whether composure would hold or crack. And here's the part that changes everything. He didn't react emotionally. No defensive explanation. No attempt to prove himself. No rush to correct the narrative. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that makes the other side wonder if they miscalculated. Because when someone underestimates you, they expect one of two things: submission or explosion. They weren't prepared for composure. They weren't prepared for someone who understood exactly what was happening and chose not to play along. There's a difference between not noticing and noticing but waiting. And he was waiting, watching, letting the moment stretch just long enough for everyone else to feel it. That's what makes this powerful. It wasn't betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was quieter than that. A shift in respect. A decision made without saying it out loud. He won't respond. That assumption? That was the mistake. Because restraint is not weakness, and calm is not fear. Sometimes composure is simply preparation. You could see it in the way he held himself. Not rigid, not tense, just centered, as if the outcome wasn't uncertain to him, as if he already understood where this was going. And that's what raises the real question. What do they think would happen? Did they believe silence meant acceptance? Did they assume discipline meant hesitation? Or did they simply misjudge the difference between peace and patience? Whatever it was, one thing became clear in that moment. They weren't dealing with someone emotional. They were dealing with someone deliberate. And when someone deliberate decides the line has been crossed, the response is never random. It's intentional. And that's when curiosity turns into anticipation. But this wasn't really about them anymore. It became personal the moment it stopped being about ego. From the outside, it might have looked like a simple challenge, a small act of disrespect, something that could be ignored, and he almost did ignore it. That's what makes this different, because the first instinct wasn't to respond. It was to endure, to measure, to give space for correction. There's a quiet strength in someone who doesn't react immediately, someone who understands that not every moment deserves energy, not every comment deserves attention. He had built his entire life around discipline, around control, around mastering the self before mastering anything else. So this wasn't about pride. It was about principle. There's a difference. Pride reacts to protect image. Principle responds to protect values. And in that moment, the tension wasn't external. It was internal. You could almost feel the calculation happening. Is this worth it? Is silence stronger here? Is walking away the higher ground? Most people assume restraint means weakness, but restraint often requires more strength than reaction. He didn't clench his fists. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. He stayed centered. But inside, something shifted. Not anger, clarity. Because when your character is tested publicly, the real question isn't whether you can respond. It's whether you should. And that decision carries weight. If he ignored it, the message would be clear. The boundary is flexible. If he addressed it, the message would be different. Respect is not optional. That's where the tension lived. Not in aggression, in responsibility. There's a burden that comes with being composed. People expect you to absorb everything, to tolerate more, to always be the bigger person. But even patience has limits. And you could sense that he was reaching his. Not dramatically, not explosively, just quietly. That quiet tension is what makes this moment powerful, because it wasn't about proving dominance. It was about refusing to let discipline be mistaken for passivity. He had spent years refining control, over emotion, over impulse, over reaction. So when he finally chose to move forward, it wouldn't be because he lost control. It would be because he decided control required action. That's the part most people miss. The strongest response isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the calm decision that says, "This isn't about me. This is about what I stand for." And once it reached that point, it stopped being optional. Now the situation wasn't just uncomfortable. It was defining, because walking away would no longer be neutral. At first, silence protected dignity. It showed maturity. It showed control. But as the moment stretched, silence began to mean something else. It began to look like acceptance. And that's where the emotional cost increases. When someone is underestimated publicly, the impact isn't immediate. It spreads quietly. Perception shifts. Confidence shifts. Energy shifts. Not because of what happened, but because of what wasn't addressed. If he turned away now, the message would settle into the room. He can be dismissed. He can be tested. He won't respond. And reputations are rarely damaged by loud failures. They're shaped by quiet impressions. This wasn't about winning anything. It was about preventing something. Preventing the idea that composure equals weakness. Preventing the belief that discipline means hesitation. There's a psychological tipping point when bystanders begin choosing sides internally. Not verbally, not physically, just mentally. And once that happens, respect either strengthens or erodes. That's the weight of the decision. He understood something critical. Walking away would protect peace in the short term, but it might cost credibility in the long term. And credibility, once questioned, is difficult to restore. The tension wasn't explosive. It was strategic. You could see the calculation. What outcome preserves principle? What response maintains balance? Because overreaction would validate their expectations, but underreaction would validate their assumptions. That narrow space between the two is where real discipline lives. And that's where he stood. Not angry, not offended, evaluating. There's a powerful difference between reacting emotionally and responding deliberately. If he responded emotionally, the story would become about temperament. If he stayed silent, the story would become about weakness. But if he responded with control, the story would shift entirely. That's why the room felt tight. Not because something dramatic had happened, but because everyone sensed a decision was forming. And once that decision was made, the dynamic would never return to what it was moments earlier. This wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about what kind of standard would be set. Respect, once redefined, doesn't easily revert. And that's why anticipation grows strongest, not before action, but before choice. And then it happened. Not the reaction, the decision. There's a subtle difference between someone who reacts and someone who decides. A reaction is impulsive. It's driven by emotion. It happens to you. A decision is deliberate. It happens because of you. And in that moment, you could see the shift. It wasn't in his posture that stayed steady. It wasn't in his expression that remained composed. It was in the stillness becoming intentional. Up until now, he had been observing, measuring, allowing space for the situation to correct itself. But when it didn't, that's when clarity replaced patience. There was no visible anger, no dramatic gesture, no sudden escalation, just a quiet understanding. This requires a response, not to dominate, not to intimidate, but to define. The room sensed it before anything changed physically. Energy adjusts when certainty enters it. The uncertainty that had been hanging in the air dissolved. Not because something explosive occurred, but because something settled. He wasn't unsure anymore. That's the release of buildup. For minutes, tension had been growing around a single question. Will he respond? And the answer became clear without a single raised voice. Yes, but on his terms. Calm confidence is different from pride. Pride tries to prove. Confidence doesn't need to. He didn't move quickly. He didn't rush to speak. Precision doesn't hurry. When someone is truly disciplined, every movement has purpose. Every word carries weight. Every pause is intentional. And that's what made this moment powerful. It wasn't loud. It was controlled. The kind of control that doesn't come from suppressing emotion, but from mastering it. You could feel the recalibration happening. Those who had been comfortable moments ago were no longer certain. Because the assumption had been simple. He won't respond. But they misunderstood something fundamental. Restraint is a choice, and choices can change. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It was definitive. A boundary, once flexible, became fixed. A presence, once tested, became undeniable. This is what discipline looks like under pressure. Not shaking, not exploding, not overcompensating, just steady. That steadiness is what shifts power in a room. Because when someone chooses to act with composure instead of emotion, they control the narrative. There was no rush to prove anything. No need to perform strength. Strength was already present. What changed was the willingness to demonstrate it. And even then, it wasn't theatrical. It was precise, measured, minimal. That's the difference between someone who fights to win attention and someone who responds to restore balance. The buildup had created tension. The decision created clarity. Now everyone understood. This wasn't about ego. It was about standard. It wasn't about reacting to disrespect. It was about correcting it. And correction, when done with discipline, doesn't require chaos. It requires intention. In that moment, the dynamic shifted permanently. Not because of force, because of certainty. The uncertainty was gone. The hesitation was gone. The testing was over. What remained was calm resolve. And calm resolve is far more unsettling than anger. Because anger is predictable. Control is not. That was the turning point. Not an explosion, a decision. And once that decision was made, the outcome was no longer in question. Only the execution. And execution, in the hands of someone disciplined, is never accidental. Looking back, this moment wasn't about pride. It may have appeared that way on the surface, a response to being challenged, a reaction to being tested. But underneath it, something more important was happening. It was about boundaries. There's a quiet difference between defending ego and protecting principle. Ego reacts to feel bigger. Principle responds to stay aligned. What happened here feels less like someone trying to win and more like someone refusing to shrink. That's an important distinction because boundaries aren't about control over others. They're about clarity within yourself. They define what you accept, what you tolerate, and where you stand when pressure rises. From this perspective, the response wasn't dramatic. It was corrective, not to embarrass anyone, not to dominate a situation, but to reset a standard. And maybe that's the real takeaway. Sometimes the strongest statement isn't loud. It's simply the calm reminder that respect isn't assumed, it's maintained. But here's what most people don't realize. The decision itself wasn't the most important part. What followed was. Because once he chose to respond, the situation didn't unfold the way anyone expected. Not the observers. Not the ones who initiated it. Not even those quietly waiting for tension to explode. Something shifted, but not in the obvious direction. And that's where the story truly begins. You might assume the outcome was predictable, that a moment like this leads to dominance, humiliation, or clear victory. It didn't. What happened next wasn't loud enough to shock the room. It was subtle enough to redefine it. The dynamic didn't change because of force. It changed because perception changed. And perception is more powerful than reaction. The individuals who were confident moments earlier began reassessing. Not because they were overwhelmed, but because they realized they had misunderstood something fundamental. They had misjudged discipline. They had misread silence. And when someone's entire strategy is built on underestimation, discovering you were wrong carries weight. But here's the part that makes this moment different from every other confrontation story. The response didn't just resolve the tension. It exposed it. Exposed who was watching. Exposed who was aligning quietly. Exposed who respected strength. And who only respected noise. And that exposure changed relationships in ways that weren't visible immediately. The room didn't erupt. It recalibrated. There's a powerful shift that happens when someone corrects a narrative without chaos. It forces everyone else to reconsider their position. Were they spectators? Supporters? Opponents? Neutral? In moments like this, neutrality becomes difficult. And that's what unfolded next. Not a dramatic finish. A silent restructuring of dynamics. Some walked away thinking they had witnessed restraint. Others walked away realizing they had witnessed control. And a few understood something deeper. The real power wasn't in the response. It was in the timing. But the part that truly changed everything came after the tension dissolved. Because once respect is reestablished, expectations change. Future interactions shift. Boundaries solidify. And those who once tested limits begin calculating differently. What seemed like a single moment became a turning point for what followed. And that's what most retellings skip. They focus on the surface event. They ignore the ripple effect, the quiet aftermath, the subtle shift in hierarchy, the recalculated behavior. That's the unseen detail. Not what happened in front of everyone, but what changed behind the scenes. And when you look closely, that change reveals something far more important than a confrontation. It reveals influence. It reveals presence. It reveals how calm certainty can alter an environment without ever raising its voice. So the real question isn't what he did in that moment. It's what that moment did to everyone else. Because the aftermath tells a different story than the tension itself. And once you understand that shift, you'll see this wasn't just a reaction. It was a reset. What happened next proves it. And that's where the deeper breakdown begins.